Greetings, everyone. So the last time we spoke, we talked about the discovery of the Mississippi River and the efforts on the part of the French to establish a colony there. LaSalle's experiment didn't work, so it takes a few years later. But by this time, the French royalty, Louis XIV, recognizes the need for some colony, some location at the mouth of the Mississippi River to secure this possession for France. So the first French settlements that are going to be established looking ahead are going to be rural operations controlled by the monarch. These were underfunded and without any sense of clear purpose. They wanted a presence, but they had no idea how to do it. And that's what's going to cause tremendous problems throughout the early colonial period for the French. Indeed, actually, throughout the French experience. They would later end up turning to private adventurers, privatizing. One would be Antoine Crozat. That would work for a while, but then collapse. The second would be John Law. These are men who sought social position and riches through the colony. The colony was very poor and broke, so they met with little success, just as the monarchy did. But they did secure the colony, had an established place here. Instability, economic dislocation, food shortages, disease, and the low quality of immigrants all persisted throughout this French colonial period to make life difficult. But despite all of this, the French recognized the need for having a colony. So they were very successful, profitable fur trade. And as the fur trade was expanding further to the west, the need for a new means of getting the furs to market was there. And that's why the Mississippi River was so important. The need to restrict Great Britain to the East Coast. It was known that Great Britain, at the very beginning, when they established their colonies on the East Coast, claimed territory based on latitude, where it would come completely across the continent. They had no idea how big the continent was, but it didn't stop them from claiming everything on an east-west basis. So the idea was to keep Britain restricted to the East Coast. Had to make a stand against Spain in the Gulf. Even though the Spanish had technically abandoned the area, the fact remains that the Spanish had a presence there and were a threat. These three countries were in constant conflict with one another in Europe and throughout the colonies. A drive to establish a colonial empire. They recognized that Spain had a massive empire, England was building one, and France needed one as well. It was the competition that was there. Mercantilism. Mercantilism was an economic system where you set up colonies and the colonies were dependent upon the mother country. It was absolutely critical for, in this period, to establish colonies. So this was an opportunity to achieve that goal. They wanted to control the Mississippi River because they realized that this Mississippi River, they didn't know the full extent of it and its tributaries, but that everything came down to the center at the bottom of Louisiana, meant that if you controlled the Mississippi River and the base of the Mississippi River, the Delta, you controlled the whole center of the country. Conquest of the essential portion of the North American continent followed that conclusion. There was a military imperative. The travels of LaSalle and Tonti proved that the Mississippi River was critically important. Louis Philippot, Count of Pontchartrain, now you know where the lake gets its name from, was the chancellor. He saw the need for a presence at the mouth of the river. His son, Jerome Maurepas, now you understand the other lake, was a minister of marine. He agreed. Vauban, who was a famous military engineer, recognized the importance as well and threw his support behind it. So with these three going, Louis XIV recognized the need as well and was determined then to establish something. But who would do it? These are the two gentlemen come into play, Iberville and Bienville. Iberville is the older brother. Bienville is much younger. These two brothers will be founded Louisiana in the city of New Orleans. Pierre Lemoyne Iberville was chosen by the French government to establish a colony in Louisiana. The international situation, the struggles between these three major powers demanded that some sort of action be taken. So he would end up in his life making three trips between December 1698 and his death in 1702. His first trip at Badine and Morin sailed in October 28th, 1698. They stopped at Saint-Domingue, which is Haiti, because every time you would cross the ocean, your food supplies and your water in particular would become putrid. So they would always stop at Haiti, which was the closest port of call, get a rest, get off the ship, resupply the ship with food and fresh water, and then continue. And that's what he did. It brought 200 settlers and 70 Marines. And the idea was to establish a position in Pensacola. That was the goal. But just like today, information leaks out. So on January 24th, 1699, Spanish get wind of what the French are up to. So they immediately send ships. It's far closer. Their port was in Cuba. They immediately send ships and established themselves at Pensacola. Later that January, when the French arrive, Pensacola is occupied by the Spanish. They're allowed to stop and visit and talk, but then told to move on. Iberville sails west. He starts heading towards Mobile. The high bluffs around the Mobile River convince him that this is not what Tonti had talked about. This is not what the indications of LaSalle's survivors discussed. This was a river, but it wasn't the Mississippi River. So here's an early map that comes out of the Mississippi River in its northern Gulf. Searching for a site, Iberville leaves Mobile Bay and he continues westward. If you're familiar, you have all these little islands off the coast of the Gulf Coast. And Iberville was tracking alongside these islands, stopping at each one. The first one he stopped at, he called Ile de Massacre. He called it that for the simple reason that when they arrived there and his men got off the ship and explored, they found this great big sand dune. And in digging through it, they found the skeletons of many, many people, fairly recent, in fact. So they called it Ile de Massacre. The second island they passed was a very small island, but covered with trees. They called it Petit Bois, small trees. The next island, as the story goes, they passed, was named Horn Island. The reason for that was you had to speak in horn. When the ship captain is at the back of the ship and the wind's blowing towards his face, if he's trying to get his orders held, he held up a speaking trumpet and spoke through it so people forward could hear. As myth goes, it fell over the side around Horn Island, so they called it Horn Island. Ship Island got its name for the simple reason that the ship could land there. Around the back, it was deep enough for a ship, because if you know anything about these islands, the waters around them were very shallow. This one afforded anchorage, so it gave them a base to operate from. Cat Island was called such because once they achieved Ship Island, with the telescopes, they could look over at this other island. They saw it covered with what they thought were cats. It was actually raccoons, but they didn't know what a raccoon was at that time. Chandelier Islands were a strip of barrier islands that lay below. They were called Chandeleur Islands because they were discovered on Candlemas Day. So you can see these unique names were provided by the French on the most simplest of circumstances. They made Ship Island their base. Again, because it had a good anchorage, they offloaded everything and set up their camp on that location. At that, once they've established themselves, they set up a boat and went to the shoreline, probably somewhere along Biloxi, to establish what was going on and try to meet some of the local natives. When they did so, they met an old Indian man and a squaw. They had some other Indians there, but they fled into the woods. Then the old man and the squaw weren't able to get away. The squaw kind of snuck away, but the old man was just incapable of doing so. And there's a tragic incident involves. The French, seeing this old man and recognizing that the other natives in the woods are probably watching what was going on. Now remember, this is December. It's kind of cold. So what they decided to do is to build a hut around him, give him some tobacco, give him some other gifts from the French to show that meant no harm, and they built a little fire to keep him warm. As the story goes, the wind picked up, the fire spread to the hut and burned the poor old man alive. This obviously sent the wrong message to the local natives. Later, they would find the squaw, track her down, sit her down, and talk to her because they're trying to find the Mississippi River. And she would tell them there was a very large river just to the west, the Malabonka. Iberville and his brother then went back to Ship Island and planned an expedition. And with 50 men, they decided to go to the mouth of this Malbancha River. It would take them 4 days. First contact with the Mississippi, they fought tides and fog. It was cold, trying to make it to the river's mouth. As they worked their way, they slept on flooded islands. There was no firewood. They were constantly cold. If you know anything about the mouth of the river, there's really not a whole lot there. And then finally, a storm coming out the Gulf rolled them up on the rocks. The Spanish had called the river Palisades because of all the rocks. And they were fearful that their boats would be crushed against the rocks and they would either drown or be trapped in the middle of nowhere. However, as they approached these rocks, they discovered that they really weren't. They were just mud caked over pieces of driftwood, not rocks. They didn't do any damage. And the waves forced them over the top and into the calm water. That's when they realized that they were in something. They tasted it. It was fresh water. They were in a river. It took formal possession in the name of King of France by planting a cross on this site, which was the second time the French declared the area of Louisiana as French territory. They named the river St. Louis, not the Indian name Mississippi, which is river everywhere. This is an early map showing what they believe was happening. And this is where they believe they came up. First explorations. They explored upriver until meeting an Indian village that had a red stick. It was probably just nothing more than a line of demarcation between two tribes. It was a red cypress tree stripped of bark, and they had all sorts of animal heads and skins on it. They called the area Bâton Rouge, which is French for red stick. They continued to Point Coupé, which is a cutoff point. They were searching for LaSalle's East Fork. Remember when we talked about LaSalle's expedition that they went 3 different directions and came back to the head of the passes. The East Fork is what they were looking for, and they weren't sure where it was. So they felt if they could find this East Fork, that would establish for them the reality that they were indeed in the Mississippi River. They also were looking for the Quinipisa Indians, whom Tonti had met and given them the letter. That would again prove that they were on the Mississippi River. But up to this point, they found no reinforcement for that. Local natives did tell Iberville there was a stream to the east. So Bienville is not certain if this is what they mean, neither is Iberville. So Iberville tells his brother, listen, I'm going to take this little stream to the east and see where it goes. That little stream is the Amita River. It would lead him to Lake Maupassant, which he would name. It would lead him to Lake Pontchartrain, which he would name. And he'd travel along the south coast of the Lake Pontchartrain, constantly working his way to the east. Bienville, for his part, would take his men and his canoes, and he would go downriver to the mouth of the Gulf and then head back towards Ship Island and await his brother. He takes the route through what's called Manchac, which is a Choctaw name for back way. At this time, this little river was 10 feet wide and 3 to 4 feet deep. They had an Indian guide, but he left them. They found an island, they camped on the island, and they got up and then they left and they headed on their way. Along the way, they discovered they had a bag of peas, which they used for food, which someone had forgotten on the island. So they called it Pea Island. So you can see the names of these islands they come up with are rather interesting and simple. He arrives at Ship Island within hours of each other. Bienville then turns around and says, I found something. This is the letter from Tonti. I discovered the Quinipisa Indians. We now know this is the Mississippi River. So this is the route, if you follow here. This is the Mississippi River. And what he does is, this is this canal. I don't know if you can see the cursor. He follows the canal to Lake Maurepas, into Lake Pontchartrain, along the southern reaches, out through the Rigolets, and up here to Ship Island. While Bienville comes down this way, comes out, and goes up to Ship Island. So they've now explored this region. They decide it's time to make a fort on the mainland. So they established Fort Maurepas. And this was kind of built in an area of sandy soil, but it was a presence. It was a semi-permanent presence, intended hopefully to be permanent if it would work out for them. Bienville now decides to head back to the Mississippi River. His brother Iberville has gone back to France to get some more settlers and some more supplies and report what they've discovered so far. Bienville takes a group of men and decides he's going to head back upriver and explore further up. In the process of doing this, he reaches what is present-day Natchez and runs across the Natchez Indians. This will be the second time. The first would be LaSalle. This will be the second contact with the Natchez Indians, and they would develop some bit of a friendship because Bienville apparently had an ability to learn languages, and he was trying to learn everything he could by opening relations with them and learning their culture. At this time, he was just 18 years old, so try to figure how young these men were when they were doing these tremendous things. He began learning Indian customs and languages. He wanted to understand the people he was dealing with. When he's coming down the river, he's just in a canoe. He discovers when he starts to come around a bend, there's an English ship anchored in the river. This alarms him. This is French territory, but this is a ship and he's in a canoe. What do you do? So, look at that. Okay. This here is the river, and this is Carolinas. Now, what the English had done, they had settled along the coast here, but when they settled on latitude, so they claimed everything across here. The other mountains, the French claimed everything between these mountains, everything drained by the Mississippi River. So you have two national claimants to the same territory. So Iberville comes down, and it's right here is where he discovers the ship. This is an example showing how the Carolina, how they travel completely across. So from the English perspective, this was their territory. And the intention they had under Daniel Cox was to send ships here to Carolina. And he had land that he had been given to the west. He was going to sail down around, come up the Mississippi River, and establish a colony here on the Mississippi River, a British colony, and have a group of men travel across land and meet with them, somewhere probably around present-day Memphis. This is Daniel Cox. He purchased the land in 1692. 1698, he sold 500,000 acres to Sir William Waller. He sent in 1698 two brigantines to settle in the Carolina areas to the west. They had to winter when they got there because it was cold. Remember, this is at the exact same time of winter that Bienville and Iberville are arriving in the Gulf Coast. When it clears up in the spring, that's when he decides to head up the Mississippi River. So once they get there, what do? He travels down with his two canoes. He discovers Captain Banks. Some records have him as Captain Bond's ship downstream. It's anchored. This was only one of three ships that were originally sent. And as I said, trying to move west from the Carolinas. They want to establish a kind of near Natchez or above. What he does is incredibly bold. But he's 18. He paddles up to the ship, beats on the side of it, demands to see the captain. When he sees the captain, he recognizes the same captain that his brother had defeated in Canada in a conflict at one time. He informs the captain that he's intruding on French territory. And furthermore, he's here on a mission of mercy because around the bend is a French fleet, which will blow him out to water if he continues on his way. So he suggests on humanitarian grounds that the captain turn his ship around and head out and accept the fact that the French have now claimed this area and into every intention of securing it. That area is now called English Turn, and that's how it got its name. So you see it's this bend in the river. Now it's a serious bend. And the deal is a sailing ship coming up, when you try to make a turn of this magnitude, you can't do it. You have to wait for the winds to be favorable. So what you do is sail as far as you can, anchor, and wait for the winds to shift so you could move on. That's what Captain Bonds was doing. He was waiting here. But this gave Bienville geographic knowledge of how important this bend was, because nobody could come up and sneak up on any settlement that was above that bend. This generated an urgent need for French presence on the Mississippi River. In lieu of this thing, Iberville returned to France, learns of the British, from France, learns of the British attempt to take the river, and decides he has to do something. So he decides to build Fort de la Boule at the mouth of the river. It's lightly armed, has one 40-pound cannon, and a 40-pound cannon doesn't mean the weight of the cannon, it's the weight of the cannonball it throws, and two 18-pound cannons. At this point, Henry Tonti has knowledge of what's going on. He comes down with 10 canoes, 50 men, and furs. He's ready to trade. Excuse me. When they see the activity at Fort de la Boule, they stop and they help build the fort. But flooding and mosquitoes force abandonment in 1707. It's just untenable, and nobody wants to be there. It will be totally abandoned when the city of New Orleans is founded. Iberville explores again. Bienville builds Fort de la Boule. Iberville explores upriver to the Natchez, and he meets the Natchez Indians. On return, he takes that Amite River again, and he goes along the bottom shoreline of Lake Pontchartrain, and he's pestered the whole time by what he calls Mariquins, mosquitoes. The French weren't used to this, and they were horrible, as you can imagine. He stops at a bayou. He calls it Bayou Saint-Jean. And when he stopped there, he sees an Indian portage, which is like a trail. He follows it upriver, and it brings him to the Mississippi River. So this is the first Frenchman to actually arrive on what would be the site of the city of New Orleans. It's somewhere around, it's Bayou Road, but it's, you follow up Bayou Saint-Jean until you get to Bayou Road, which is somewhat adjacent to Esplanade Avenue. It makes him the first one to walk on the site. Iberville will leave again. When he returns, he has 50 colonists had died of disease, supplies were short, and the rest wanted to go home. They were woefully unprepared for what they had to contend with, and they weren't properly supplied by the French government. Count de Pontchartrain issues a set of written orders. He had heard hills were green with emeralds, the Gulf waters were saturated with pearls, and gold and silver were available. The typical things that people hear. Of course, the Spanish had proven it was nothing like that, but the French weren't aware of that. That was intelligence for the Spanish court. So as a result, they actually believed this foolishness. The grand affair is the discovery of mines to get all this great wealth. So the royal purpose of the French adventure was much like that of the Spanish. The quest for riches eclipsed nearly everything else, with the demand to occupy the mouth of the Mississippi River and allow the fur trade to flourish. Founding of Mobile. They needed a permanent settlement. So rather than look at the mess they had at the mouth of the Mississippi River, they decided that it was time to find another location. The sandy soil along the coast where Fort was built at Biloxi was not suitable for raising any crops. So they moved the city to a site called Mobile, near the mouth of the Mobile River. They built a fort, 375 feet, with guardhouses, residences, and towers. And they maintained a maritime base at the Ile de Massacre, which was offshore because the water in the river was too shallow for the ships to go up. But Dolphin Island, you could get close to. We call it Dolphin Island because what happened, there's no way they can encourage people to come to the Isle of Massacres. So as a result, they changed the name to Dolphin Island. The Dauphin is not dolphin like the fish. Dauphin is the name of the son of the king. So this was named after the young child Louis the 15th. Iberville called a meeting of all the chiefs of the surrounding tribes and encouraged them to work together because they were constantly fighting one another. And he recognized that the English are moving from the east. They were a threat. He had to build allies among the Indians to help protect him from the French, his colony, but also to protect them from the English because the English were selling the Indians into slavery. He gave them gifts and he forged an alliance with them. He encouraged them to think that if they ever have any struggles between themselves, to allow him to act as arbitrator rather than result into warfare. But mostly, he wanted to frustrate English expansionism. This is a map showing the Mobile district. Here's the fort, and these are the plots of land that were given out for cultivation purposes. And back here's the forest. Iberville would leave and return again after a short months. But then Queen Anne's War broke out with England. And he was ordered by the French government to go to the Caribbean and fight for the islands, drive the English off and protect the French islands. While there, he contracted yellow fever. He was later brought to Havana, where he died. At that point, Bienville now takes over as the lead of Louisiana's development. Corruption? Can't be, not in Louisiana. Soon after his death, people who weren't really friendly towards him opened up an investigation into Iberville's actions while sailing back and forth between France and the colonies. The Count of Pontchartrain had heard rumors from different people. First, there were financial dealings that he had was somewhat questionable. He was accused of smuggling. Iberville used the colony to his own benefit. He would bring things to the colonies and overcharge them for that. He would take furs, whatever they had from the colonies, and bring it to France and sometimes smuggle them in. He imported goods into France illegally because he not only went to the colonies, he apparently, when he left France, he would travel around the Caribbean, going to different islands, picking up trade goods and smuggling those into France as well, making himself quite wealthy. When battle took place, he would sell the prizes on the side. What are prizes? If you're at war with another nation, what you generally would do is attack the other nation's merchant ships. When you captured them, you'd bring them to one of your ports, like a French port if you were French, and then you sell the ship, you ransom the passengers, you sell the goods, and you split the money between the French crown, your officers, and your crew. Well, apparently what Iberville was accused of doing was bringing them to a neutral port, selling everything and keeping it for himself. He overcharged the colonists for their supplies. He's basically accused of running illegal operations from France, Martinique, Saint-Domingue, and Louisiana in the Gulf and making himself quite healthy profits. Meanwhile, the colony itself was suffering. As a result, Pontchartrain becomes angry. He's not excited about Louisiana anymore. He's pretty well put off by it. So when he cools, the initiative to help build the colony cools. The war with England demanded total attention, which became a major distraction. As a result, very few ships arrived in Louisiana while the war was going on. The people weren't getting any supplies. And these are people who hadn't really learned how to live in this new land. They had developed some relations with the Indians, but not enough at this point to know how to survive. Supplies ran short. The colonists that were here suffered greatly. Many died of disease, most likely scurvy, which is a vitamin deficiency. Some even went so far as to go live with the local Indians because they felt like they could only survive that way. They also found that the soil in Mobile was a little better suited to cultivation than Biloxi. It was sandy. It wasn't the type of soil that you can have a good full growth of crops in. And the fur traders that came down to train furs When they arrived, they're looking for places to stay, booze to drink, and food to eat. And they became a burden on the colonists because they made these demands and the colonists couldn't fulfill them. Furthermore, there were no profits to be made because so few ships came that by the time one did arrive, a lot of the furs that were brought down had deteriorated. They weren't marketable anymore. The colonists then felt totally abandoned. Also, the issue is they had very few women, and women are the core of civilization from my perspective. I found that in my research in England, in the English colonies, that they're a civilizing influence. And the need was if you're going to have a strong colony, you have to have women because you have to have families. Stabilization, most colonies were from the meanest sort. They didn't get good people as you had in England who were upset because of social or political or economic or religious reasons. Nobody wanted to leave France. So what they were doing was just grabbing people off the streets and emptying prisons and taking prostitutes from prisons and sending them to the New World. Most were brought against their will, and they weren't the best people. Don't make a false parallel, but I mean, it was almost like if going out and finding homeless people in nowadays in an inner city and putting them on a ship and sending them to Louisiana to become colonists. They don't have the initiative to do that. Send me wives for my Canadians, Bienville cried, because the only suitable people there were people who had come down from Canadians. And he wanted to establish domestic tranquility. He wanted to establish a stable colony. He needed wives. They sent 23 girls in 1704. In 1704, the colony only had 195 living settlers. 8 officers, 72 soldiers, 14 Navy men, 10 shipboys, 40 Canadians, 16 laborers, and now 23 women and 3 priests. They were in deplorable condition. They were dressed in rags. They ate only corn, acorns, oysters, and fish. And many of them, when they arrived, soon died because they thought when they got to the New World and a colony that things would get better. But when they arrived, they found out no, because the people in the colony were waiting for them to bring them good things to eat. So it was a terrible situation. And it worsened. By 1706, the colony was reduced to 85 inhabitants. The Mobile settlement was struck by floods and destroyed what supplies they had in some of the buildings. A pirate ship from Jamaica, remember we talked about the idea of ships attacking one another, commercial ships, attacked off an island, stole whatever they could, and burned what was left. In 1708, the population increased to 279. Now think about this. In 1750, the English colonies had almost 1 million people. Here you have 279. But by 1710, it's down to 178. So you have 101 died. The situation deteriorated worse and worse. And as a result, Bienville and the commissioner, Nicolas de La Salle, because the French government had a governor and a financial agent. They weren't joined together, 2 different offices. And these men started fighting one another. And La Salle started bringing charges against Bienville. When he did this report, and they got back to France, that's when they realized that how bad the situation was. And any voluntary immigrations at that point ceased. The Crown decides it's got to do something. So it thinks in terms of, let's put this in the hands of a private businessman. So 1710 had moved 8 lives up the river from the bay. They moved the site in Mobile. It's now the present site of the city of Mobile. And they built a fort there, Fort St. Louis de la Louisiana. It was completed in 1711. So at this point, they had Mobile, the little fort in Biloxi, and Dauphin Island. Fur trade grows, and as a consequence, some trade starts happening, and other products start coming downriver. Corn, bear meat, foodstuffs from Canada. Trade also opened with Spanish Pensacola because the Spanish in Pensacola had likewise been abandoned. So the Spanish had connections in Mexico City, but no ship to get there. The French had the ship, but no connections. So Bienville worked out a deal with the commandant in Pensacola. I'll loan you my ship if we split the food. And you go to Mexico City to get it. So even though these 2 countries were in competition, these 2 settlements had to work together in order to survive. Antoine Alexander Romoville was the first person they contacted in order to start private enterprise. He was a merchant ship owner, and he thought he could save the colony. It was a joint business venture, but he personally lacked finances, so he sought to get other people to invest in the operation. He agrees to equip the Romanée for a third voyage to Louisiana. But having been a privateer, his goal was he wanted to be the governor of Louisiana. Then delays constantly came up, and his ship doesn't really leave until November of 1710. Pontchartrain then would turn around and tell him that, listen, you do what you can. It's your responsibility to survive, to make this colony survive and support it as best you can. And we will pay you when time would permit. Well, can you imagine signing a contract when you get paid back when it's to the other person's convenience? Especially government, you might never get paid. So Rumford took 10 months on a voyage. And what he did was he filled his ship up with tobacco. Likely he went to the American colonies. And he came back with the intention of selling it on the black market to get back some of the money he was owed. As soon as he arrived, the king got wind of it and seized all of the tobacco and sold it for himself. Romoville was driven into bankruptcy. So that was the very first experience. The next is Antoine Crozet, which is interesting. Antoine Crozet was a consulate and financial secretary and very wealthy man in the king's cabinet. He had very humble origins. Supposedly he grew up on a large estate as a simple boy, but he had a great ability for mathematics. And the owner of the place decided that he could use him. And as he worked with the boy and gave him more and more responsibilities, Crozet proved his abilities tremendously. As a result, he ended up handling all the man's finances and eventually would establish his own money and do quite well for himself. He then decides that the king decides that he wants Crozet to do the same success he experienced here with the colony. So he establishes the Company of Louisiana and gives Crozet a monopoly. Now, there's a myth about this that I'll talk about, but there's really no truth to it, but you might hear it somewhere, especially in Garay's story of the romantic history of Louisiana. And supposedly he had a daughter named Andrea who wanted to marry a young man of higher social standing, and the other boy's parents wouldn't allow it. So Crozet was willing to sign on to this thing, knowing that once he created the wealth he wanted to create and built a colony the way he wanted it, he would probably be promoted to a position of a marquis, which would put him in a higher social position and allow the marriage to take place. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be any truth to this story, but that just shows you how you have to be careful in reading history, that there's stories circulating that aren't supported by fact. Anyway, he expected to make profits. His vigilant scheme was to merely set up a monopoly of imported goods from which he charged exorbitantly and to buy furs at a song. That was it. He'd overcharge the colonists and underpay the fur traders, and that way he would reap all of his profits. He only had two obligations, which is to bring 2 ships per year, bringing 10 men and 25 tons of goods. The monopoly of all trade was restricted to Crozet's agents. He then turned around and raised prices by 300% and cut the prices for the goods coming from the colonists. Now, the colonists were already on their knees and broken. This is a man who has no concept of what he's doing. He's looking for quick profit. Conditions get worse. The weak economy got even weaker under Crozet. And when his first immigrants arrived, locals referred to him as totally naked. When the weather turned cold, they had to be given shoes, underwear, blouses, and linen stockings from the supply of people who had nothing for themselves. The census of 1713 has 19 families in Mobile and 16 inhabitants in Dauphin Island. So you see, the French are not making much of an effort to get this colony to reach its critical mass so it can survive. They had one longboat and a brigantine, and a brigantine's a medium-sized vessel, And that's the one Bienville was using with the Spanish to get supplies. Defense of the Mississippi River had to be forgotten. They were barely making it where they were. There were just 10 men living at another location called Biloxi, which is basically at the mouth of Bayou Saint Jean. And this was by Louis Jean Rousseau Saint Denis, who was a relative of Bienville. Jean-Baptiste Cadillac is named the governor. He established the city of Detroit, and that's why you get the Cadillac automobile. He arrived in 1713 and met a population that was reduced to poverty. They had no corn, no flour, and much of the garrison had gone off to live with the Indians. Lamarth arrived with 25 women. None would be taken by anyone. Most of them were prostitutes. In his report, believe me, this whole settlement is not worth having. Given the opportunity, all would run away. If I would send away all the loose females, there'd be no women left here at all. This gives you an indication of how bad the situation was. Bienville and Cadillac immediately start fighting. Bienville expected to maintain his position as governor. He didn't like the idea of Cadillac taking over, and he certainly didn't like the policies of either Cadillac or Crozat. Okay, he arrived arrogantly, convinced of his superiority, which rubs Bienville the wrong way. He depends on having all of his orders immediately obeyed, no matter how ridiculous they might be. He determined to change the habits of the colonists, that Bienville recognized you got to deal with what you have to deal with. You can't impose things on these people because they're not really high quality people to begin with. He's in a survival mode, and Cadillac is in the idea that he's going to change this colony and make it work. He also changed the Indian policy. Bienville had been taking goods and giving them to the local Indians. He recognized how important it was to maintain good relations with the Indians, not only to keep the Indians from attacking them, but also to open up trade for the food products and other things they needed, and to keep the English at bay. From Cadillac's perspective, that was just a waste of company money. So he said, you can't do it anymore. This really concerned Bienville. So when Cadillac travels up to Illinois looking for all the gold and silver that's supposed to be there, Bienville starts going back to his old ways of doing things and starts the Indian problems by reforming treaties and giving them gifts again. The whole point, because the English now are starting to move further and further to the west and starting to interfere to some extent with the Natchez Indians, a faction of the Natchez Indians. At this point, Cadillac decides he's going to establish the first permanent settlement. The Spanish have now established themselves pretty well in Texas, and they look like they're encroaching from the west. So Louis Saint Denis is contacted. He arrived in 1699 with his cousin Iberville, and he lived in Bayou Saint John in 1716, 2 years before New Orleans was founded. Cadillac contacts him and tells him to go up the Red River to keep an eye on the Spanish and to build a fort up there and a settlement to make a permanent presence so that he could see that the Spanish weren't moving any further. So he explored Louisiana, Saint Denis. He knew the local Indians. He knew the terrain very well. So they decided he would be the perfect candidate. The Spanish had the same idea. They set up a settlement as well. So while the French set up Natchez, the Spanish set up Nacogdoches. Then Cadillac realized that the Spanish were wealthy, that maybe this colony on the outskirts, the western part of the Louisiana settlement, could be used as a means of getting connections and trading with the Spanish for gold and silver. This would be the goal of the Crozat Company. This here is the settlement at Natchez. What did it look like? The first permanent settlement in Louisiana. It's not New Orleans, it's Natchez. And it was established in 1714. This is the site of Natchez. So they came up the Red River and established it here. The fort itself was on an island. This was the Red River. The river has since changed its course. But the idea of setting it up on an island is you're surrounded by water. So if the Indians decide to become unfriendly, at least you have water protecting you as a moat. They've rebuilt the fort as an example. This is one of the houses. This is the church. Remember, they're very Catholic. This is an oven. They'd build a fire in this clay oven, get it good and hot, put the cover over it. And once they did that, they would let the coals burn. Then they would throw their bread in there and put the door in front. It's covered up because rain would break it down. His mission, he wanted to open up trade with Mexico. So Cadillac realized that this was a chance of doing something, and he was worried about the English moving in from the north. So he sent him to the Presidio to meet with Don Diego Ramon, the chief officer of the Spanish possession. Once he arrives at Nacogdoches, he's arrested because he's a Frenchman in Spanish territory. And he's imprisoned at the home of this gentleman until such time as Diego Ramon can contact the Spanish authorities in Mexico to find out whether they'd be welcoming to Saint Denis. While he's there, he falls in love with Emanuela, and she falls in love with this charming Frenchman. The French father sees what's going on, so he decides to offer Saint Denis a captaincy in the Spanish army. And in that way, he can have his daughter in marriage and he'd now become a Spanish officer. There's no way Saint Denis is going to give up his French heritage. He's not interested. He then gets word that he can travel to Mexico, which he does. When he arrives, he's immediately thrown in prison despite the letters of protection. He achieves forging a treaty of commerce with the viceroy, the Duke of Henares, because he's a good talker. So he's able to explain the purpose of his mission and that both sides would benefit from the trade. So he gets his treaty of commerce. He then returns to Louisiana with prospects of good trade taking place. He gets supplies to open up the trade, and he heads back to Mexico. The contributors wanted to travel with him, and he informed them that open trade had not been granted yet, that he has access, but not them. Some insisted, but once they set out, they saw how arduous the trip was. They turned back and let him take their goods with him. When he arrived in Mexico the second time, the viceroy he had cut the deal with was on his deathbed. And the person who took over, Father Alvarez, who hated the French, had Don Martin de Alaron, who's now in control when the old man was dying, had Saint Denis arrested. He would be thrown in prison and possibly threatened with death. But he would escape, and it would take him 3 years to work his way from Mexico City back to New Orleans, traveling by night, and stole horses whenever he could to make his journey. Once he arrived, he explained what had happened and told them, in essence, leave me alone. I'm not interested in any more of your adventures. So he retires. He reported to Cadillac, forget it, all hope with trade is now lost. He built a strong colony there, great relations with the local Indians. He was a very tall man, supposedly good looking, and he had his French clothes he would wear, which are extravagant silks and all this sort of stuff. But at the same time, he had close relations with the local Indians, and he allowed them to tattoo his body with their tribal symbols, which a lot of times were birds and insects and butterflies and what have you. So here you have this dignified Frenchman, but when he took his shirt off, he was covered with tattoos, and he built very good relations with the local Indians. As a result, Natchez would never become big, but it would be permanent and it would prosper as best it could. He would die in 1744 after living in the colony for 41 years. Other events? The Pelican arrived from France with provisions and a variety of other items which were desperately needed. 2 nuns and 23 unmarried women arrived. They were married before the end of a month. But September was bad. When these ships arrived, they had stopped at Saint-Domingue. They'd picked up yellow fever. And Henry Tonti and 30 of the new troops that he brought with him would die of this epidemic. Once again, the colony was in desperate straits, this time because of a disease outbreak. However, an incident would occur which would open the door for settlement. First Natchez War. They have developed good relations with the Indians, they thought, but conflicts between the British and French were starting to grow along the frontier. Prince Hughes, a British trader, convinced a faction of the Natchez to attack a French settlers and traders north of Mobile River. Several French traders were killed and their goods were stolen. Cadillac wasn't about, so Bienville was in charge in New Orleans at this time. When he hears about this, he's furious. So he travels up to Mississippi River to an island in the river opposite the Tunica village and built a fort there. He then invited the local troops, the local Indians, to smoke the calumet, which is the peace pipe. Establishment of Fort Rosalie. After the chiefs arrived, came time to smoke the pipe. He refused to do it, and he had them arrested and thrown into a prison he had built. He then told them what had happened. He held them until the Natchez local son, Oliope, who had committed the crimes, was executed. Because one Natchez Indian there was proud of what had happened and said so to Bienville, so Bienville had him killed. The others were horrified at one of the sons being killed, one of the leaders of the tribe, and he told them, "You never should have attacked my people. You know the rules. You have the same rules. Somebody attacks you and kills one of yours. We attack you and kill one of yours. One of ours, you kill yours. That's just the way it works out. And you understand that. So this is what I want. All goods have to be returned." He had to supply 2,500 logs cleared off and ready to build a fort. And I want the head of the people, the heads of those who had killed the Frenchmen. All these things are given. And then he builds Fort Rosalie on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. It's named after the wife of the Count of Pontchartrain. So the first city that's established on the Mississippi River is in New Orleans. It's Natchez in 1716. The Rosalie House, it's a plantation house, stands near the site of where that fort was today. Slavery. Cadillac was confronted by a workforce of questionable value. Decidedly, this colony is a monster without head or tail. Obviously, these people weren't of the quality to do any real work. Pontchartrain would not permit forced immigration of regular people, so the quality of settlers was limited to prisoners, salt smugglers, prostitutes, and vagabonds pulled from the streets of Paris and other port towns. He wanted a reliable workforce. There's only way you could build a successful colony. Senegambia, off the coast of Africa here, was a French settlement, a French colony. This is where most of the slaves in these early years would be coming from. This is a closer view of it. Slaves were imported by and owned by the company. In New England colonies, individuals bought slaves. Here, they were owned by the company. In 1716, 500 slaves are imported. By 1721, 2,000 slaves were living in the colony. So you can see how big the slave trade had become as a percentage of the population. They provided the labor for public construction, levees, any public buildings, drainage, as well as work in the fields for food. Some slaves were sold to private owners, but the problem was you had to pay cash for them, and they didn't have that. But they would be the primary labor force in the very founding of the colony. Cadillac then introduced the Code Noir, which was a black code. With the introduction of laws came the need for a system of laws of slavery. Cadillac's slave code reflected the French and Catholic view of slavery. All slaves must be baptized. Now, for New England, you couldn't be. It was interesting because in New England, slaves were supposedly pagans that had to be converted, but they wouldn't do anything to convert them. Here, under the French, every slave at birth had to be baptized. Slaves had the right to be married in church, and they would be in church with white people, and they would be married. There wouldn't be a question of jumping over a broom, again, as in the New England and other southern colonies. Property belongs to the masses. Slaves possess no private property. Slaves could not be witnesses in court. Freed slaves had limitation on their movement, but freeing slaves was allowed. No work on Sundays and only a half day on Saturday. Again, this is a mandate because of Catholicism. Cadillac believed the importation of slaves would solve all of his problems. It did not. There were no large plantations, so slaves generally worked for individuals in their businesses. You didn't have tobacco plantations, indigo plantations, so the slaves that were used were more like employees. Attitudes in France changed too. Slaves were no longer free when touched French soil because the French didn't really support slavery in France. So the idea was if a person brought a slave to France, he would be free. Well, that had to be changed. So the French changed the law because some people who were good slaves, let's say who was a woodworker and making furniture, well, the owner would tell him, let's send you to France to really learn the proper way of doing this. We couldn't afford to do so if the man was free when he arrived. So they had to change the laws in France. Slaves were sent to France to learn trades, but as a result, they now maintain their slave status. Slaves failed to significantly help the French colony because demanded cash, and the colonists just didn't have it. So everything Crozat did worked against making this a success. As a result, the economy started collapsing. Colony's problems grow. Cadillac and Bienville start fighting, even more so. Now it's continuous. He also found cause now to fight and struggle with the colonists. He was too orderly for these harsh conditions. He wasn't a frontier man. He was used to the pleasures of a city. It became divided, and the final breach came when Cadillac attacked Bienville for his military action against the Natchez. That's when he went after him. But this would prove his undoing, because Crozat would investigate, and he would find that it was Crozat was the problem. That means that Cadillac was the problem. And that now that word was getting out of the tensions in this new world, that people were less willing to invest or be involved in anything to do with Louisiana. He had him recalled and threw him in prison for 5 months at the Bastille. Bienville is then elevated to position of governor. In France, Louis XIV dies. And his young son, Louis XV, then is named king. He's 6 years old. You can't be king at 6, obviously. So what they would do, they would appoint someone as a regent. The regent's job is to rule in your place until such time as you reach a maturity, preferably around 18. So in his place, the Duc d'Orléans became the regent and would rule in the king's name. This marked the end of the Count of Pontchartrain's control over colonial policy, and the Duc Toulouse became the Minister of Navy, and the colonies now came under the control of the Navy. Immigration, more numbers of vagrants, uncontrolled children, soul smugglers, and women from prisons, most of them for violent crimes or prostitution. Indentured servants could be sent over where they would basically sign a contract to come. They'd have to serve 3 years. They'd get 150 liras or 300 pounds of raw sugar, which I guess they could sell. Women were taken from poor houses and off the streets. They expected 100 girls, only 30 arrived. Signor Lepine was named the governor, sent by Crozat, but he also would fight with Bienville. So Bienville would then be reduced again from being governor, and Lepine would take over. Bold ventures were planned by Toulouse to rebuild the colony, but policies on taxes and regarding merchants frustrated all of his plans. France was broke. Louis XIV had been involved in many, many wars in Europe, and it had spent extravagantly on places like the Tuileries and Versailles. So it was broken. The commercial laws and regulations, it hindered the growth of a strong merchant class because they were constantly taxing these people to get what money they could. They increased property taxes. Crozat had to pay 6.5 million lire on his vast property holdings. There's some question as to whether he lost money or made money in Louisiana, because nobody really knows. But the bottom line is the government couldn't even pay its debts to Cravat. So on August 23rd, 1717, Crozat, furious at what's going on around him, turns the charter to Louisiana over, gives it to the new king, actually in this case the regent, and steps away from Louisiana. It now becomes a rural colony again. Problems start growing again. France was worried. English expansion was continuing to the west. Spain was moving east from Mexico and west from Florida. France had already lost Acadia in Queen Anne's War, that's up around above Maine. Louis XIV's wars had totally drained the treasury. The crown was completely broke, but it had to be maintained. They could not abandon Louisiana. John Law, here's the new man. Colonial problems mount. They had 137 soldiers who lived in miserable conditions. 10 of whom were so old and infirm they were of absolutely no use. None of the soldiers had been paid in 6 months. They had no new clothes for 4 years. Imagine that. The colony was resupplied, but who was to move there? The location of the colony itself had to be reconsidered because the position in Mobile wasn't really working well. One fact was known: the soil was not good in Mobile or at Dauphin Island, so producing food, or any crop for that matter, was impossible. But Biloxi, at the mouth of St. John, which still had several colonists, was there and drew attention to that particular geographical spot between Lake Pontchartrain and Bayou St. John. John Law, a new investor. I put the name Chris Hemmeter. You all probably don't know who he is. He was a guy who came up with this tremendous idea for building casinos and everything in New Orleans years ago. He painted this beautiful picture of opera houses, $1 billion investment. It came to absolutely nothing. He was a flim-flam man. And you could make the same argument about John Law. He's the eldest son of a Scottish goldsmith. He demonstrated a very good ability in mathematics, finance, and commerce at a very early age. So he's quite gifted. When his father died, problems arose because he was a gambler. He caroused a lot with a lot of women. And he had this experience with his father's wealth when he died, but he went through all the money through just his excessive life and his carelessness, and he was just living the grand old life. He was forced to leave Scotland because he was with another man's wife, and they ended up being challenged to a duel. Well, he killed the man. Trouble is, dueling is considered illegal in Scotland, so he was thrown in prison on charges of murder. He's able to escape. He travels to Europe, and in bouncing around Europe, at this point, the main financial center was Amsterdam. So he goes to Amsterdam and he begins his life again, gambling and hanging out with the wealthy bankers and playing cards, and also messing with their wives, as is wont to do. In the process of playing cards and gambling with these individuals and socializing with them, he understands that they're talking about a thing called paper money. Up to this point, it's exchanges of gold and silver. This sounds interesting to him. So his idea is encourage a government to establish a state bank. This would be the nation's fiscal agent. Money would be put into the bank. The bank would then issue paper money. That way people can conveniently carry money in their pockets without the gold and all the weight. Most nations that he went to refused to accept his idea because they thought it was incredibly far-fetched and dangerous, because who would do such a thing? But France was broke. And when he arrived in France and told the Duc d'Orléans of this idea, when you're broke, you'll do anything. So he listened to him. He then created in 1718 the Banque Générale. He sold 100 million lire in 500 lire shares of stock. Now you have to understand something about stocks to get this. because you've seen it already in our world where the price of stocks, look at Bitcoins, can suddenly go up just as suddenly go down. So he's selling all of this stock in 500 lira shares. He issues 3 billion lira of unguaranteed paper money. Speculation grew where people wanted in on it because initially it was there. You bought your 500. Other people want to have some of the stock. You have a limited amount of stock. So they start bidding on the price of the stock. So a 500 lira share of stock was going for 8,000 lira. So the original investors would sell their stock, make all of this money, and live the high life. Well, as people saw these people living the high life, they'd ask, where did you get all this money? Oh, I invested in Bank General, which made more people invest in Bank General, which drove the price up even higher. And those who had it sold it. So it was like a cycle that was taking place. Things were looking quite good. Early investors made a fortune in this inflated market. It's a Ponzi scheme. It resembled the stock speculation of 1999. And I mentioned the Enron scandal because that was a deal where the price of Enron stock was selling, I believe, for like $49 a share. And it took it off the market when it dropped to about a nickel a share. Everybody who invested in it lost everything they had. He then establishes finance for his Louisiana project, builds the state, which were old bonds for state debt, which had value. They used those to purchase stock in the Company of the Indies, which was speculative. Many were anxious to get rid of this worthless investment because they didn't see any chance for this to come true, but it was a bond, which means it was secure. They wanted the speculative weight of the Company of the Indies. He then advertised that the colony is this wonderful place where everyone who traveled there or invested, everybody will make money. Louisiana is great. He was given a 25-year franchise over Louisiana. At this time, the colony consisted of Biloxi, Dauphin Island, Mobiles, Natchez, and Natchitoches. He thought desperately to populate the country, and he was committed to bring 6,000 white settlers and 3,000 slaves in. But Frenchmen did not want to leave France. There was no motivation. It wasn't like England where there was social and religious revolutions and political revolutions taking place. Everybody loved being in France. So he had to find some way of getting people here. His plan made arrangements with government for forced immigration. Again, release inmates from prisons if they would come to immigrate, offer freedom of prisoners if they would marry prostitutes and move to the colony. In 1719, 189 immigrants arrived. 7 tobacco smugglers, 53 dealers in salt. Salt was smuggling back then. 6 vagabonds, 10 vagabonds for Leon, 20 women arrested for fraud, and 16 women, likely prostitutes, to Roquefort prison. 50% of the women sent to Louisiana were prostitutes. Then the Mississippi boundary started. He's still not satisfied with the number of people coming in. So soon the streets of France were filled with hundreds of poor people driven like cattle to ports of immigration. Still not enough. What they were doing was basically kidnapping the poor. It would be as if you went down and found the homeless underneath the expressways here in New Orleans and picked them up, arrested them, brought them to the dock, loaded them on a ship, and sent them somewhere. And that's in essence what was happening. It then came down to kidnapping people. So then it got more interesting. The Mississippi bandits came in, and the idea was, listen, I'll give you 100 lire per head for anybody you bring on a ship. No questions asked. Whether they want to come or not's immaterial. Whether they're conscious or not's immaterial. Whether they're drunk or not's immaterial. So the Mississippi bandits, they were called, cleared the city of Paris of its rabble, and each soldier received their reward for bringing them in. Percentage-wise, more French colonists died in crossing than did slaves. Slaves had value. You didn't get your money for a slave until you sold him when you came across. In this case, you got your money for the person when you put him on a ship. So whether they made it across alive and made it to the destination had no financial impact on the people involved in the operation. So the more died, the merrier. That meant more food for the rest. Positive importations, he advertised throughout Europe, trying to find settlers. Germany at this time was in the throes of violence. So once it kind of got to Germany, many Germans realized this is my chance to escape. So families with tools and seeds and domestic animals decided to come to Louisiana. They were good farmers. And when they arrived, they moved up the river to what's called the German coast. They would end up saving a colony because these very strong individuals would end up building farms and providing food and sustaining the colony. They were the first productive settlers that come to the colony of Louisiana. Conclusions: the French early recognized the value of taking control of the Mississippi River. The French effort began with the earliest explorations of Marquette and Juliet and continued through La Salle's explorations and failed attempt at settlement. Success would come as a result of the brothers Iberville and Bienville along the Gulf Coast. Whether it's a royal colony or a proprietorship, the colony persisted, but it never profited under the French. France continually imported the wrong type of people. They built new community requires values often lacking among the lowest ranks of society. They also failed to properly invest. So thank you so much. I hope you found this interesting. And the next time we'll talk about founding the city of New Orleans. You take